G. Rose here, and today we're going to be talking about a paper called Deconstructing Common Life. And the paper is going to really focus on the philosophy of David Hume, and we're going to position him as a critique of the Continental Enlightenment. He would be, I suppose, what Isaiah Berlin would call an enemy of the Enlightenment, even. And a lot of this thought is going to be inspired by Donald Livingston, who is one of the premier Hume scholars in the world. And Hume really understood that philosophy itself could be a problem, that philosophy should be a fundamental problem of philosophy. And he was very concerned about what another individual called Vico called the Barbaricism of Reflection. And that is the idea that philosophical thought can be a force of destruction, that it can be a force of upending common life, communal life, the traditions of a society in the name of a vision of the future that is internally consistent relative to rationality, but is not tested against reality. It's something that has to be tried tried, and that trying is an experiment to determine if it works. But then, of course, if it doesn't work, it's too late. And in many respects, David Hume is very similar to someone like Edmund Burke, who was very, very critical of revolutions in general, not because revolutions are never justified, but because revolutions can often, in a very justified way, upend a society because of the corruption of government. And in no way did Burke or Hume mean to suggest that revolutions are never just. There's lots of corrupt churches, lots of corrupt institutions. The problem is when you overthrow broken institutions with no idea of what you're going to replace them with, or with a untested idea of what you're going to replace them with. And as a result, you can get a power vacuum, and that often doesn't get fixed until a strong man seizes it. So, if you have the French Revolution, of which, church and government are very corrupt, and so you can understand where the revolutionists are coming from. But that led to the Reign of Terror, and it didn't stabilize until Napoleon seizes control. And Hannah Arendt makes distinctions between the American Revolution, Glorious Revolution, French Revolution, and we do see in America an example of a revolution that is successful, but very often revolutions fall victim to the mistake of the barbaricism of reason, of having a really good idea of what a good society will look like. It's internally consistent, it's philosophically justified, but it's not backed by anything. It's not backed by actual lived experience, and once it encounters lived experience, it can prove to be very dangerous and very bad. David Hume makes this really interesting distinction between bad philosophy and good philosophy. And throughout his book, The Treatise of Human Nature, he makes all these kind of famous thought experiments where he shows that you can't ever arrive at a law of nature for causality, only constant conjunction. He argues that you can never establish a constant self, only repeating qualities. But what's really important to note is each one of these case studies is making an overarching point that I think a lot of people miss. And that's the idea that reasoning left to its own devices can kind of come up with conclusions that are kind of absurd, and that the only way to escape the absurd conclusions is to defer ultimately to common life. So we can't establish a law of causality, a law of nature. But if every single time I wake up at 6 a.m. and the sun is rising, or every time I drop a ball it falls, then it is practically the case that there is a law of nature, even if there isn't a direct law of nature, because my common life has given me reason to believe that causality actually exists. My common life, the fact that I don't transform into a different person every single day, my common life gives me reason to think that I have a constant self, even if reason itself cannot arrive at those conclusions. And there are other papers we've done, such as The True Isn't the Rational, that argues that true and rational are different categories. And I think that applies here, because what Hume is concerned about is autonomous reasoning, which would be reasoning that believes it can be rational all the way down, without ever having to refer to anything that is unrational or pre-rational. And as we argue in other papers, without a truth of which is assented to by non-rational means, then I lack a truth by which to organize and define rational relative to. If I think it's going to rain today, then it becomes rational to bring an umbrella even if it doesn't rain. If I don't think anything about today, then I can't determine if it's rational to do X or to do Y. So I have to make a probability assessment, a guess about what the weather is going to be, and then I can determine what is rational relative to it. And of course, I mean, rationality can help. I go outside, it looks cloudy, the weatherman said it's going to rain, so I can use pieces of evidence to put together what I think is going to be the best course of action. But at the end of the day, it is a kind of leap of faith. It's a sort of assent by probability and guessing. It is not 100% rational and certain all the way down. But what Hume was very concerned about is that a lot of thinkers in the Enlightenment seemed to believe that autonomous rationality was not only possible, but good, and that society should be organized by nothing else other than autonomous rationality. And this is what he would call bad philosophy. This is extremely problematic, because if rationality is going to give rise to absurd conclusions, like there's no such thing as causality, or there's no self, well then, when autonomous rationality tries to organize society, it's probably going to come up with some absurd ideas of how society should be organized, and believe that those ideas are good, believe those ideas are rational, because relative to its internally consistent system, they will be rational. But you see, rational and good are not similes. What is rational can be bad, following David Hume. And the only way to avoid this ultimate force of destruction, of deconstruction, as the paper will get into, that David Hume foresaw, was for rationality at the end of the day to defer and be humble before tradition, before common life, before ways that people have chosen through time to organize how they're going to live, because there's probably a reason they do it that rationality, especially not autonomously, can't grasp on its own. If you want, and I think it's very similar to Friedrich Hayek. Hayek makes this distinction between particular and general knowledge, where no matter how smart you are, if you don't work at the McDonald's down the street, you don't know how many plastic straws they need to order next week. So in the same way, if you don't live as a farmer in, say, Lynchburg, Virginia, you don't know what's best for the farmer, or you don't understand what the rainstorms do to the river. You don't know how difficult it is to yield a crop, how to keep the pesticides from being poisonous. And what Hume is concerned about is people who have, say, studied how to be a farmer, come up with their theories about how to be a farmer, and then they fire they remove the real farmer, the guy who's done it his whole life, because he's not very smart, say he's never read Plato or something. And so they come in truly believing that they're more competent, only to find that because they lack any practical knowledge, any light knowledge that can only be known through the common life of being a farmer, that they end up ruining the farm. And this would be an example to David Hume of bad philosophy. Now, at the same time, David Hume is not saying that no one should ever engage in rational or philosophical thought. For example, he's not saying that you should, say, stay on the farm and never learn, say, about the Enlightenment or how to think for yourself, because he believes that you're going to have a philosophy no matter what, and if you don't own your philosophy and think about your worldview, then your philosophy is going to own you. And so you have to go, for Hume, on the philosophical journey. It's kind of like the hero's quest. You kind of have to leave home, you have to question what you believe, but at the end of the day, you have to come back and settle somewhere. You have to make the road a place eventually, as the poet says, and his name escapes me, do forgive. So you eventually have to make the road a place, and at Windleberry, there we go. And if you don't make the road a place, then everywhere is going to be a road, and you're going to destroy all places to turn them into roads. Sort of like urban renewal or something, and it reminds me of that novel by Avo Andrek, The Bridge Over the River Drina, I think. So eventually, for Hume, you have to leave where you come from, go on the philosophical journey, but you do have to return to a place and ground yourself and realize that there are limits to rationality. There are limits, and autonomous rationality becomes a force of turning all places into roads. And at the end of the day, there's nowhere to go to. There's a lot of roads, but there's no place to arrive at, because you turn the world into a collection of roads. So one must avoid this. And again, as we talk about in Belonging again, if you never engage in the philosophical life, then you're susceptible to the banality of evil that can only occur in a common life that never questions itself, where there are givens that you never question, and so they do your thinking for you, and you can fall into committing atrocities and contributing to oppression, like Hannah Arendt discusses. The paper is also going to get into questions of what is the best grounding for common life. Is it identity? Is it sex? Is it gender? Is it geography? Is it occupation? How do we find the best grounding for common life that is not overly restricted, but also not overly fraying? We have to find this balance, and if we don't, then we might ground our rationality, try to ground our rationality in something that can't sustain it. And it's going to get into a discussion between the distinctions of Hume and Derrida, of which I will let you read the paper to determine. So anyway, that's Deconstructing Common Life. You can find the whole paper on ogrose.com, and thank you for your time.